I'd bang a gavel, but I don't have one. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Jacksonville Planning Advisory Board for April 10th. It's now 6 o'clock. This is the regular meeting. It's May 8th. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the minutes. Thank you. Hey, maybe I was here. There you go. Watching a replay. May 8th. Our first order of business is the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by the invocation. Nick?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for such a wonderful day. We wish we could have many more of those. We ask your blessings. We ask you to assist this world in becoming a more peaceful place. Give us the knowledge, skills, and abilities to assist the city of Jacksonville as they go toward their goals. In his name, amen.
Amen. Got a new rule now. If you correct me, you get a piece of chicken. Okay, I'm gonna pull up my agenda and read for the right one this time. Okay, our first order of business is approval of agenda. Everyone has it before them, I hope. Any changes, deletions, corrections? If not, a motion to approve the agenda. Motion
Second.
Made by Bob, second by Steve. All those in favor of the motion, please signify by raising your right hand. All those opposed, like. Motion passes. Review and approval of minutes. Well, I wasn't there, so you guys were. Bob, I thank you very much for running a very good meeting. And if everybody's read over the minutes, if there are no changes or corrections, then a motion to approve the minutes as presented is in order.
I move.
Motion's made and second.
I wasn't there.
I wasn't there.
Second by Nick. Okay, all those in favor? All those in favor, raise your right hand. All those opposed, motion passes. Before we do the city council update, do you want to introduce our new member, Ryan? Or was he already introduced?
Well, that's what I was going to do.
Go ahead, Luke. You're up.
All right. Well, I was introducing Chase Popkin. He's our newest member to the planning board. Welcome. Thank you for volunteering your time and helping out. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
All right. There you go. Easy enough.
Was that it?
That's it.
That was it.
That's all the updates we have right now. Unless y'all want to join our budget meeting.
That's a heck of an update.
Yeah, there you go. For big news.
Chase, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't be shy. It's just a camera.
I gotcha.
Old business, there's none. Let's move right to new business. Ryan, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, planning board members. We thought that we would do something a little different this month. And being that we didn't have any normal items, we thought that we would kind of use this opportunity to kind of go over an overview of the Jacksonville Unified Development Ordinance that was adopted by City Council after about a 7-year draft period. It was approved by council back in April of 2014, and it's been in effect since July of 2014. And the goal here is to kind of give a 20 to 50,000 foot view of the UDO. And we feel that that'll help the planning board members, especially with new members such as Nick and Chase, and also refresh some older board members or longer serving board members, but also serve as an opportunity for members of the public or even members of council. You know, it would allow them to go into G10 and watch what we kind of present and questions that may come up. They may find that they have questions, or it may provide them with knowledge, and that's key. And then if there's items that the board wants a little bit of a deeper dive into, then I would encourage you to kind of mention that at the conclusion or during the meeting. We want it to be kind of an open dialogue, so don't hesitate to interrupt, and we'll kind of try to cover some of that information. And like I said, it may be that, well, let's bring that back so that we can kind of get a little bit more specific information as it relates to it. So with that being said, the Jacksonville Unified Development Ordinance, it's 9 articles. There's probably 3 or 4 that are kind of boring and just kind of normal type items. See, I got ahead of myself. So, you know, some history here that I kind of covered, so we'll jump into the almost last bullet. Since we adopted this Unified Development Ordinance, we've had 47 amendments. Most of those are generated by staff, but anybody is allowed to petition this ordinance to be amended. There is an application, there is a fee, and it's got to go through a process where staff works with the request, the person making the request. We then craft a proposed ordinance. Sometimes we say, well, this is something that we can support. We can't support what you're proposing. So then do you want us to take it as you've requested, and then we'll kind of tag ours along? Sometimes we're able to say, okay, well, this is kind of the rationale, and they're fine with that amendment or however it's been drafted. A lot of times it's when a citizen asks for something, they're not going to give a specific, with the changes to 2 or 3 sections of the code that's necessary when you revise the UDO. They just say that, well, we'd like to see this. Well, then we have to kind of go through and dive into, well, what sections does that impact? So there's been 47 of those. That's about 5.5 of those a year is what it averaged, because I'd kind of just roughly want to see about how many that is. And we keep track of all of those. And we try to basically, after an amendment occurs, we try to update the webpage within a day or two, so that way anybody that goes online to find the Unified Development Ordinance, they can find the most current version. Our ordinance is not currently on MuniCode. That's where the city code resides, and sometimes people's UDO resides at the MuniCode as well. It's actually on the planning page, so it's found online. And I say that because we've had some people call and they say, well, we can't find the UDO. It's on our webpage, it's not on MuniCode. So if anybody ever asks you as board members, well, where can I find the code? It's actually on the planning's webpage. So if you were to search on a search engine, Jacksonville, North Carolina, Unified Development Ordinance, it should pop up. PDF at the bottom is about 600 pages. And that's basically this booklet right here. So that's a front and back version in a 3-ring binder of the Jacksonville Unified Development Ordinance.
Brian? Well, a lot of times I have people that will ask me questions because I'm on the planning board, and I try to explain to them that we don't see as much as we used to because of the UDO. So is that sort of the reason why we have a UDO versus a bunch of different things?
Well, I would say that the 2 biggest changes that have occurred, whether it be with the UDO or even pre-UDO, was previously subdivisions were approved by both the planning board, recommended by the planning board, and then approved by city council. Excuse me. Now subdivisions are approved at the staff level. The idea behind that is it's an administrative function. If the subdivision meets all of the city standards, and that's the Unified Development Ordinance, that's engineering's manual specifications, standards, and designs, that's the fire codes that the state of North Carolina adopts. If it meets all of those technical codes and the zoning allows that district to be subdivided into multiple lots, then it doesn't require any kind of a special approval. And I can't remember if that was pre-UDO or post. And then the other big change was previously anything over 25,000 square feet required a special use permit. And that was eliminated some years ago, to where now the board doesn't see those businesses, those developments like they used to, because we eliminated that threshold. Now you could build, staff can approve 100,000 square foot building, doesn't matter the size. What does matter is when you hit that 25,000 square foot threshold, below 25,000, it's approved by staff. Once you go over 25,000, it actually goes into a management report where it is, council has 5 days, and if there's no objections, it's deemed approved. So those are probably the 2 biggest differences now versus maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Control the size of buildings, do y'all inspect like the college and the hospital?
Our building officials do inspect all of those. We have level 3 inspectors that are able to do the full array of buildings. Now, some of those buildings, like the college, for example, sometimes they have to go through state construction office, I believe is what it's called. Mm-hmm. And then there's also with like hotels, that also has to have a review by this Department of Insurance, I believe. So sometimes there's another 3rd and 4th party agency that kind of takes a look at things. But there's not a whole lot of them that do that. And I'm 99, I can't remember. I know that 25,000, we'll get into that in Article 2, I believe, but at 25 and above, it's approved by council technically, even though it just goes to a management report and it's deemed approved at the end of five business days. And then below that, staff, if the plans get stamped by all the TRC members today, it's approved.
A more streamlined process.
It is, and if your ordinances and standards are like they need to be, then, the developers know what they need to kind of lay out as far as parking and landscaping and buffering. So once they meet those technical standards, then moves it on. Then the other component is not just square footage, but there are some uses that are special uses. Those special uses are gonna always go before the planning board and city council the way Article 2 is currently written, and that's the approval board. It could be the Board of Adjustment. I think Onslow County allows their Board of Adjustment to approve the special use permits. When we went through the UDO process, we had that conversation and council wanted to leave it kind of the way that it was. And you'll find that information in Article 2 as it relates to those approval steps. So as I mentioned, 9 articles. So Articles 1 and 2, really just housekeeping. One's, just welcome to the UDO, it replaces the old zoning ordinance that was adopted back in 1972, I believe it was. If there's conflicts with state laws, the strict rule applies basically, where if the state law says we can't do anything about a particular item, then it kind of says that, that conflict would be eliminated. So I'll give an example. The legislature has recently introduced a bill that would allow accessory dwelling units. So if you have a garage in your backyard and you want to convert the space to an accessory dwelling, Jacksonville does not allow that. Accessory dwellings are not allowed. When the UDO was adopted, we actually talked about that specifically. That was one of the items that we needed council clarification on, and council said no accessory dwellings. Well, there's actually a bill that's being considered right now that would not allow the cities or towns or counties to prohibit accessory dwelling units in a single family type district. So if that law gets passed by the House and the Senate and signed into law by the governor, our ordinance will be in conflict. So let's say that it gets adopted tomorrow and it takes us 2 or 3 months to bring this revision to revise that code, the UDO, this code, through the process. We will be able to issue permits to convert an accessory, a building to an accessory dwelling as soon as that law goes into effect, even though technically the UDO will be in conflict.
So you're not just like a garage or a shed, you're talking about like another house, right?
Well, you could, if you can convert your garage into a dwelling unit and have it meet building code, right now you cannot do that per our UDO. If this law changes, we won't be able to say no to that accessory dwelling unit. So we're only allowed to do what the state allows us to do. So if they say we're not going to be able to regulate accessory dwelling units, 1 per lot in a single family zoning district, then our hands are tied.
And then what if like a neighborhood has like a HOA, does that trump?
It would not trump the HOA, from what I understand. The HOA laws would still apply.
Gotcha.
So.
A similar thing is with ETJ, correct?
In terms of what?
If the state ever does away with ETJ entirely?
Correct. So that's also another bill that we've introduced several times over the last couple of years. If the ETJ is eliminated, let's say it gets eliminated tomorrow, then even though our maps need to be updated officially, and we may be able to make an official change with that anyhow by just dropping the ETJ areas off. So we will have to deal with that accordingly. But if it's no longer in our ETJ effective tomorrow, then we are no longer going to be the permitting agency. The difficulty there is that creates a little bit of limbo in terms of the county's going to have to adopt zoning. So it may be that the law says if it gets adopted that the zoning for the city would be able to remain into effect or remain effective until X date to allow the county time to establish their zoning. Hadn't really looked into the details of, well, how will that work? If it passes, then, we'll have to determine whether ours is gonna stay and we'll permit until, however much time, or if the county just has to deal with it starting tomorrow. I think that's a bigger issue that they're gonna face than it will be for us, because us backing out of it is different than them taking it on. So with Article 2, that's the items that basically outline all of the approval processes. So what does the Board of Adjustment approve? What does the Planning Board approve? What do they recommend? Variances, interpretations, all of those items are found in the UDO, and I'm probably gonna get ahead of myself, so let's just go ahead and move on to this. Okay, yep, see, once again, I got ahead of myself. So Article 1, general provisions, you have purpose and intent, applicability, establish the official zoning map and rules for interpreting boundaries, and we also established the transition from the old code to the new code. Here we go, so caught up. So this is a table, it's actually a table and then also a flow chart, that with the adoption of Unified Development Art, we try to make this more user-friendly. So the table in the middle is literally a list of the different types of approvals, procedures that planning is responsible for, and then it basically identifies whether it be City Council, Planning Board, Board of Adjustment, the Technical Review Committee, or TRC, or the City Manager or their designee, as far as whether they can approve, decide, recommend, decide, etc. So if somebody said, hey Ryan, who would issue a zoning permit? Well, that would be the City Manager or their designee. So that would be me and my staff. And then, well, what if I don't like the decision you made on the zoning decision? Well, that decision would be heard at the Board of Adjustment at a public hearing and an appeal. So if I were to deny a zoning permit, that is their recourse for that denial. So in this table that you see on the screen, I know it's really small, but it basically outlines all of what, how they're handled. And then on the right side is a flow chart, and this is of a zoning map or text amendment. And primarily, it probably more important for the zoning map because of the information about the neighborhood meeting at the top. So we always recommend, hey, if you want to make a rezoning request or a text amendment, have a pre-application conference with us, before you make application and pay an application fee. Then if it's like a rezoning, we can say, well, we think you need to have a neighborhood meeting, you need to have a neighborhood meeting, you're required to have a neighborhood meeting. Or sometimes we say you don't need to, but by the time it gets to City Council, there may be 100 people here, and the mayor and council can say, well, we're gonna push you back to, you need to go talk to the neighborhood that's in your area around you to have some conversations before we're gonna hear this moving forward. And staff just tries to basically make a determination based on the factors: where are you located, what are you trying to change to and from, what's the likelihood of a lot of questions coming up, which could really, create a lot of questions and length of time for City Council to kind of have to debate it. And that way you can go debate that with, you, the applicant, and the folks that are going to be impacted potentially, to maybe work some of those items out before it goes to City Council. Sometimes it's just the fear of the change happening. That, well, I know it's not doing anything now, but if you change that zoning, then what is going to happen, next door? What does that mean for me? What does that mean for my property values, et cetera? So, this is the flow chart. So submit application, we make sure that it's complete. If it's not, we can reject it. If it is complete, then staff will review and we will prepare a staff report. It goes to the planning board for recommendation. After that, we then schedule a hearing, and then we will send out the public notifications per the general statutes. So whether that be signs, letters, et cetera.
Did you say that was changing?
There's been so many things changed. It used to be that you had to go to everywhere within 200 feet, and then it went to, I think currently it's just those that are adjacent to the property. And then there used to be a thing called a protest petition, and then that's been done away with, and which required a supermajority of council, but now that's not the case. If, let's say that there's 5 people that own property together and 3 of you submit an application to rezone it, well, all people have to sign. Mm. So we would say that's an incomplete application. You need to go back and get the other 2 signatures, because we don't want to bring a request and then all of a sudden half the family or owners be like, yes, we're for it, and the other will be like, no, we're not, because that doesn't work. So the statutes clarify that it requires all the property owners to do that. Now staff, if we petition council to rezone, then the government's able to do that. So now we still have to advertise accordingly. And then we go to city council for the hearing, so there'll be a public hearing and then a decision. All right, so moving on to Article 3. Any questions on 1 and 2? Pretty straightforward. That's probably the least questions that we get on 1, definitely. Article 2, there may be some questions just trying to understand, what's my process. But if somebody were to pick up this book, you can very quickly see who decides, who appeal, where does the appeal go, et cetera. So really beneficial. Before we didn't have that. So, sometimes we might be like, well, what should we do, in terms of, it's kind of laid out there in a nice table. Another table that's in here is required public hearings. So, we go through and identify what type application requires public hearings, and then the public notification comments. So all of this information, even though it's in general statutes, it's also a lot of times in here. Or one of the things we've also done recently is we will identify the statute where it's found, so that way, if the statute changes, that means we have to change the UDO unless we identify the statute. Then we just direct people, well, go look at the statute and follow what the statute says. So we've kind of started to do that. That way, we don't have to revise the UDO just because the statute is revised. Going back up. Okay, so Article 3, zoning districts. Before we had this whole column on the left, I believe there was, I want to say there was 40-some odd districts that we had, believe it or not. And then we consolidated those into the new districts and we've created 1 or 2 new ones. The RSF 40 is a new district. We actually don't have any property zoned to RSF 40 currently. And then we also have a more recent amendment was looking for it here. Oh, it's probably not going to be on here because we pulled this from the UDO, the old UDO, but basically the mobile home districts that we created, the mobile home district that's in here. So, but if you look in the UDO online, then you will see the exact districts that we have, and you'll see that those 2 have been added. We also have the downtown mural overlay district that you'll find in Article 3 now. And let's see. We have overlay districts. So overlay districts is a district that, I'm going to go ahead and leave it on here. This is the current zoning map. This is on the city of Jacksonville's GIS system. So anybody can actually pull up this map from the web page and see what the zoning of the property is, adjoiners, et cetera. But we also have overlay districts. We've got several of those. We've got the mural overlay district, flight path overlay, billboard overlay, and adult business overlay. And basically, within these zoning districts, if you're allowed to do certain things, there may be another caveat like the flight path overlay. So let's say that there's a proposed school and it's allowed in this district, but then it's in the flight path overlay. That then triggers a special use permit.
Doesn't the courthouse do that?
The courthouse is in a flight path.
Yeah.
So if you have a building that's over a certain size, certain heights are limited, you can't go over 100 feet. There's additional stipulations on certain things within that flight path. Same thing with adult businesses. There's only 5 adult business overlay districts in Jacksonville. There's only 4 businesses within those areas because they have to be in certain areas, and then they also have to meet certain spacing criteria from daycares and schools and churches and residential zones. So billboards, same thing. There's only certain highways that the billboards can be on. They have to meet certain spacing criteria, et cetera. That's another one I can tell you as far as the legislature, every year there's something about the billboards being on the legislature decision box. So from right now, one of the ones that came across the desk of the day was, the billboard industry's ability to clear landscaping in the DOT right away. And, before it was, just a small amount, and then it went like this, and now they want it like this so that, you can see the billboards from a distance. Now, that's DOT right away versus private property. It doesn't apply on private property. It applies within DOT's right away. Let's see what we have next. Here's an example of a zoning district. So for all the different districts, you have a purpose statement. And this is where you'll find your setbacks. So, a lot of calls that we get is, well, how close can can I build my house to the front street? How close can I build to my side property line, et cetera? This is where that information will be found. And of course, along those same lines, a lot of times people say, well, how close, from the back of curb, where is it from the back of curb? The problem is, it's not from the back curb, it's from the property line. The only way to know where your property line is to have it surveyed. So, the back of curb is not the measurement, it's from your actual property line. So property line, right-of-way line is one and the same. On this side, it's for the city or the DOT to maintain. On this side, it's your property, your private property. So, all your setback information, lot coverage is found here. So one of the things that we added here, because we felt like this was an important part to bring up in our overview, this may eliminate a question that would come up and say, well, hey, we want to see more information on this, is that within the districts we have setbacks, but we also have allowable encroachments. Before the UDO, we didn't have this. This gives staff a little bit of flexibility that we didn't have prior to the UDO. And that's maybe part of why the board doesn't necessarily see things either, is that some of this stuff has been built in that we didn't have previously. And items like, this next one's probably, the number 3 here. So chimneys, HVAC units, decks, porches, covered or uncovered, or carports may encroach into a required setback up to 50%. So if you have a 7-foot side setback, you can build a carport to 3.5 feet. Before it was 7, there was no wiggle room. The only way that there had been wiggle room is you could have requested a variance. If you look at the standards within a variance that's in the statute, it is very difficult to get a variance.
Ryan, I noticed you had HVAC units there. Where does a home generator fit in?
Same part. Even though it doesn't say generator, we consider it the same thing.
And the propane tank?
Correct. Okay. Now, the one place we don't have flexibility on would be easements. And, so for example, let's say that you were going to put an above ground or a below ground propane tank, and you're proposing it within an easement, we cannot permit it. So if there's an easement down inside of your property line, that would impact your ability to utilize this allowable encroachment. But I mean, this standard here, this I won't call it an exception, this allowable encroachment, this has helped us a lot compared to what we had before.
And this is for the staffs. They can make judgment on that.
Well, I mean, we would allow it all day long at the permit level, and it's at a staff level, yes. So, I mean, if you want to, carports and decks are probably the two that we see most times where, you're already in the house. Hey, I want to add on to, I want to put a carport on the end, or we want to do one of these, it's not even attached to the house, but one of the detached carports. So, 50% encroachment. All right, so those are kind of the, pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot of questions that usually come up with those first 3 articles. Article 4 is where we're going to kind of start getting into what I call the meats and the potatoes of the ordinance. And I may do like I've done twice already tonight and get too far ahead and have to come back. But Article 4, this is where you look at what your zoning district is, and now what can I do on my property? So if you're zoned commercial, what type of uses can I put in that zoning district? What uses can I not? So it's, once again, this table of uses we didn't have before. So this gives you one location. So you can, if you're looking for a specific land use, you can look right across that page from left to right. Is it permitted? Is it prohibited? Is it a special use? So if you were looking for, let's say, a religious institution, you want to build something like a church, you could go straight to that section in Article 4.1, and then you could go across and you could see every zoning district that, that use is allowed within. That gives you the strategy to say, okay, well, I need to find a piece of property, I need to find a zoning district A, B, C, or D. and I know that I can build it that way as a permitted use. And then these other two districts would be a special use, so that means I'm gonna have another layer of approval. And then the one thing that this did with the UDO that you consider good or bad, depends on what side of the fence you're on that day, but we didn't have it before this UDO, is that last column on the right, it says additional standards, 4.2. It's basically what we call use-specific standards. So not only do you have to meet the standards of the Unified Development Ordinance, generally speaking, in Article 4.2, we're going to get into additional standards that are only applicable to that type of business. So, for example, telecommunication towers, new cell phone towers. We have a use-specific standards that wouldn't be applicable to any other use but cell phone towers. And it's about 10 or 15, 20 pages of use-specific standards as it relates to building a new cell phone tower. You have items such as a mobile home park. It outlines what is needed for a mobile home park. What are the standards? Parking, driveways, trash collection, etc., specific to that type of use. The adult business stipulations that I mentioned a minute ago, that is also within the use-specific standards, but also in the overlay district. So you can see that that's one of the more complex ones that we have where, overlay, special use permit, use-specific standards, and under that scenario, that's kind of your worst case scenario where you have an overlay, zoning stipulations, use-specific standards, and a special use permit. That's one where, that's going to be your most involved approval process versus one that's permitted and doesn't have any use-specific standards. And we do have some of those. There's no additional standards that, you can look down this, the table that I have here, which is on the 4th page of it, there's a lot more blank spots here. But if you look on the right-hand side, the first 4 of the top 5, there's no specific standards. You can see there's only one, which is a horse stable. And that's where we say, for you to have a horse stable, you have to have this much acreage. You have to have this much room for your pasture, this much room for your stable, etc. Very specific to a horse pasture, stables only. No other use is going to need to have those standards. In Article 4, so we've got 4.1, which is the use table. 4.2 is the use-specific standards. 4.3 is accessory uses. And then 4.4 is temporary uses. So, and every one of those also has use-specific standards for those uses. So, let's see. To give you an example, so once again, got ahead of myself. So, you'll see here that I pulled the use-specific standards specific to an extractive industry. 1,000 feet from any residential district. Probably the most strict separation we have anywhere in the use-specific standards, because the idea is that you're going to have dust and noise and trucks and this, that, and the other. We want it to be far enough away from a residential zoning district or a community center, child daycare, or educational facility. Then we also have, it's got to be screened by a solid fence. It's got to be at least 8 feet high, located no less than 100 feet from any right-of-way, and then 50 feet from any adjacent property that may be a commercial type zoning. The only one that you're going to see like that more than likely is this industrial extractive industry.
But that's like a concrete plant or something.
Yeah, it's like a mining, digging.
Yeah, I think the concrete would have something different, but same principle. So, before, we had parking and landscaping standards and buffering, signage. That was pretty much the gist of it. Now with UDO, with some of these more intensive land uses, we have stricter standards. One of the ones that's probably the most common, and I'm going to mention things that basically the board may say and city council may say, and an applicant could say, well, those rules are too strict. Entirely possible, but one of the ones we've seen a lot of times is a wrecker service. you have to have a buffer all the way around, and it's gotta be 50 feet on all sides for where you're gonna have your storage of vehicles. The idea behind it is most, if not all of you will remember, and we've had some of those in years past, and in essence, they become a salvage yard, unfortunately. And the idea behind it is, we want to make sure that it's screened appropriately and set back off of our, not next to our main highways. And of course, a salvage yard is different than a wrecker service, but we have those standards in place for all different types of uses. So somebody may say, well, I think 1,000 feet's not enough, or it's too strong. Of course, I can also tell you that I don't know that we've ever had a request for an extractive industry since I've been here. But you have to have standards in place in case you do have something that, because you do have some out in the county. So.
Would a well be considered that, or?
Like a water well?
Yeah.
I don't think so. This would be more like a principal land use of land. If you just have a well site on your property, then.
Gotcha.
So then we get into accessory use standards. So likewise, we have standards and limitations, a use where they can be, maximum heights, lot coverage, use specific standards for accessory uses. Same thing with temporary use standards. So think about things like, this is where you will find accessory buildings. This is where you will find our, remember a few years ago where we created the standards for the backyard chickens. Your backyard chickens will be in the accessory, I believe it's accessory. Let me get there.
Our temporary uses, more things like porta-johns. Is that where we put food trucks?
No, so food vendor is an accessory use.
Okay.
So just to run down some of these, an ATM is an accessory, a canopy, a family daycare in-home, a food vendor mobile, which is the food truck, a detached garage, home occupation, an ice house, backyard chickens, outdoor storage, a parking structure, a produce stand. That's one where we had somebody the other day that this time of year you have the strawberry vendors that set up. So you've got, and there's sometimes it sounds like it may be a produce stand, but by definition it may not be a produce stand. It may be a something else. And in fact, I believe the produce stand, if we were to look at the definition, I believe that's where it's on the same lot that the farm is, basically. So while one would look at it and say, oh, the person that's selling strawberries here, that's a produce stand, it's not. It's a temporary use. And I'll get to that here in a second.
But does it get a permit for that?
You may or you may not, it depends. So within these sections, it will tell you whether a permit is required or whether it's exempted. And it will also say whether you can do it 1 day a year, 3 days a year, 10 days, 15 days a year. So the annual festival that happens at the mall where they do the carnival, that's maximum number of days, and so they have to get a permit to do that.
Gotcha.
Those little strawberry stands, they have to.
So that, because actually I talked with a gentleman the other day that was wanting to set up one.
And the firework tents?
Yeah.
Correct. So under the, let's see.
What about those meat trucks you see out there?
So mobile retail, we do not allow.
Gotcha.
So cannot sell retail of goods from your vehicle. Specifically prohibited. That may be a good thing, that may be a bad thing. It depends on what side of the fence you're on.
You see
You
people
still see
selling
them going
puppies.
around.
Yeah.
You see people selling puppies out of their vehicle all the time. Is that not, they're not supposed to?
Correct.
Okay.
And some of that is there's also a peddler's license that the police department enforces, and it gets a little gray there in terms of was that them or us. But I know that, I think from the animal sales component, the police department handles most of that. But if someone were to call and ask us, we'd say we don't allow mobile retail.
Well, what's also gray is where's the city limits start and end?
Oh, no,
At the
that's,
sign.
Yeah, well, at the sign,
no, that can,
but yeah.
you gotta look at the map, but I can show you,
Right.
this is the parcel where it stops and
Yeah.
starts. But to the layperson, yeah, it may be a little bit more complex, but that's why we're here. That's part of part of our daily duties to let you know whether you're in the city, ETJ, or in the county.
Where do yard sales and flea markets fit in?
Flea markets is a use. Yard sales, that is let's see.
They just happen.
Well, it would sound like
It's a temporary,
Yeah.
garage or yard sale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's no permits required, but there is stipulations but that's a temporary.
If they were
use.
adding a tent to their yard sale, would that require a permit?
Was it one day a year, is it?
I mean, let's just say,
Once a month, 2 months, you know.
well, I was gonna say 2 days once a year, but I mean,
So if it's residents, more likely you're okay. A lot of times with tents, the fire department gets involved with tents over a certain size just because of the flammability concerns. So it may be that you don't have to have a zoning permit from my office, but you may have to get a fire permit approved by the fire department, which also comes to our office. We basically kind of central hub, take in, a lot of the permits and then disperse them to the other departments that have a play in it, or have a role in it. So just to kind of run down the temporary uses. So expansion or replacement of existing building facilities, including temporary offices for construction or security personnel. Real estate sales office model sales home. So if you have a new subdivision, you want to set up a model home, we have standards for that. Then we have construction-related activities for new construction, relocatable classrooms, school system. That one's been a popular item over the years. Pods, the temporary storage pods, the Connex boxes. So you can have them temporarily, I think 90 days in your front yard. You can have them indefinitely in your backyard. But they have to meet certain standards. It can't be over a certain height, size, etc.
Connex boxes fall under that?
So if somebody has one set up in their front yard, they're supposed to get a permit for it, and it's limited to 90 days. So, and when I say 90 days, then there's sometimes where there may be one 30-day extension may be granted. And then a lot of times that would be through me. And then if there's another extension request, that would be through the city manager. It just depends on what's going on. Do you have a building permit? Are you having a house renovation that requires a permit? You need to store your stuff because you're having your hardwood floors redone. I mean, there's ways to deal with, is it temporary, truly, or is it that you want it as a storage accessory building? But it's not a building by building code, so it's not a structure. But by our definition on the zoning side, we can regulate it. But you can have one in the back of your house as long as it meets the standards indefinitely, as long as it's not in a setback, it's not in an easement. Still need a permit for it. So, some other items is sale display of goods other than agricultural products, seasonal agricultural sales. I think that's the strawberries like we're talking about. If you look at the definition, a lot of times we have to go look at what the definition says. Is it a protein? No, that's actually where you grow the crops and you're selling on that same parcel of land versus this being a seasonal agricultural sale. That would be your
Farmer's market.
well, no, that's different. This would be like your
strawberry lady out in front of Jeff's Burgers.
Oh, yeah.
right, and then pumpkins, Christmas trees. They
Down
would
at
fall
church.
underneath that category. And then we have sidewalk and vehicle use areas. So, for example, we have Sam's Club. Right now, they have their area to their side of their building where they have blocked off, 50 parking spaces, and they have their seasonal. They actually have a plan that they identified to us that says, here is where we're going to block this off every season. Walmart's got the same thing.
Lowe's.
Don't have one. But basically, if there's one that comes in, we look at, do you have enough parking? Where are you going to have that area? Don't block drive aisles that are needed to kind of traverse the site. We want to make sure that the fire truck can gain access on all sides and that you meet the standards. So if you don't have enough parking, then you can't do something in the parking lot. And that's the same thing like when we have the mall with the carnival. We've gotten it down to a science now, but basically, if the ordinance requires 1,000 parking spaces in Article 5.1, and you only have 900, well, then you're minus 100 right to begin with. You can't have a parking lot sale or a carnival because you don't have enough parking for your regular business.
Now, for the mall, how does that work since there's like front and back parking? Does it,
It would
does
be
the
the
whole
cumulative.
property? Okay.
Yes. So, give an example, I'll use Sam's. They've blocked off some of theirs for their seasonal. So let's say that they have that going on and now they're right at their required number hypothetically. This is just hypothetical. Now they want to have a food truck rodeo, which they've had one this year to kind of benefit their charity, their cause. I believe it's the Children's Miracle Network, that they had a food truck rodeo for that charity. Well, if they only have 1,000 spaces and they already have 100 of them taken up with seasonal and they're required 900, well, now they don't have any additional. So they would have to basically do that at a different date. They couldn't do it at the same time that they've already taken up all the other spaces. So that's one of the things when we look at with permits is, do you have room to have that type of activity? If you don't, to have your normal day-to-day operations, then you don't have room for that activity. Does that get some people a little bit upset? Sure, but at the end of the day, you have to have enough parking per our UDO standards. So it makes it easier when we have a site plan on file. So when people come see us, that's the first thing we do is we have a site plan on file. It makes it really easy because we'll send you a copy. And since we started using E-Plan review back in 2012-14 timeframe, since then every site plan that's come in, we've got a copy of it electronically, and I could email it to you. It's going to probably take me longer to find out the plan name if somebody came in with XYZ company, but it's for the sheets. Well, I'm going to look for sheets. I'm not going to look for XY company. So whenever that comes in, we do try to basically identify with an address, or we'll put in parentheses sheets, just so that we can find that later on more easily, so that we can share that information and assist our citizens that want to do things like this. So this is probably one where there's a lot of traffic in and out, people that don't know the law necessarily. Well, and that's part of what this discussion is tonight, is that, if somebody says, well, I want to have a temporary whatever, well, they can watch this, they can come see us, whatever it may be. And like I said, the board may want to see a little deeper dive into this after tonight's meeting. So, and then when we get in Article 5, now, Article 5, this is our development standards. So this is applicable to basically everybody, but it's really affiliated with the development approval. So most of the people that are going to be applying this are going to be your surveyors and engineers for a lot of these standards. But then you get into the fences and walls, that's going to impact every landowner that wants to have a fence installed. We have limitations. For example, and I'm probably going to repeat this because it's probably on a slide moving forward, is that in residential zones in the front yard, you can't have over a 4-foot fence. But here's the kicker. You don't have to get a permit for it, but we have standards. So if somebody were to call and say, well, hey, do I need a fence permit? No, you're good. You don't need a permit. Residential. I'm only speaking residential for a minute. And if they ask that question, that's the answer they get. The problem is, well, do you have any limitations? Yes, we have standards. So you can't have it within an easement. Well, I don't know if I have an easement. Well, we'll try to help figure that out. There's a lot, technological advances, just even the last 20 years. For the most part, you can pretty much find, back to, I would guess 1970s, 80s, you can even go back to map book 1, you can find on the register of deeds. Some of them may not be the most clear, but you can see whether you have an easement on your property. The problem is that if it was platted in 1970 and there was no easement, but in 1995, there's an easement that was put on there for a water main project, then you're not going to find that in that 1970s plat. And that's where, it may take a little bit more digging, or you may later find out, oh, wait a minute, I put a fence up in an easement and I shouldn't have, or an accessory building is in an easement, it shouldn't be. So, parking, landscaping, fences, walls, lighting. The biggest thing there on lighting is we got a maximum height. The biggest thing that we really look for is we want that dark sky standard. So if you buy a light fixture, that U in bug that U has to be a 0. So let's say you wanted to add a wall pack to your side of your building. You need a permit for that most likely, although there are some things that the state legislature, well, not the legislature as much as the code council has basically said, well, as long as you're a licensed electrician, you can put it up without a permit. Well, that means without an electrical permit. You still need to get a zoning permit from planning and permitting. Most electrical folks probably aren't used to a zoning permit. I mean, we didn't have a zoning permit before the UDO was adopted in 2014. So, but we want to see that U rating 0, and then we also have maximum lighting at the property line. The idea is light pollution. So we have standards. We didn't have those standards really prior to this UDO. Transportation impact analysis.
So stuff's up before, I guess it's grandfathered in if it's been there?
Correct. Now, if you go to change that fixture out, that's different than changing a light bulb out. If you were to decide to swap the fixture out, then you have to comply with that U0 standard.
How do they come up with like a rating for like where the property line's at, the brightness to that? Is there like something that measures that?
So what we use most of the time is, most of the light fixtures come with, we call it a cut sheet. And let's say that this wall pack is on this building, that the light is going to project and go to 0 15 feet away at the building. So if you measure 15 feet, let's say we have a maximum illumination level of 2.5 at the side property line. Well, if that building, if it goes out 15 feet and that building is 5 feet from the property line, then we may have a problem. If the building's 20 feet away and it cuts off at 12 feet, well, then you're 8 feet to the good. So we don't have to have a photometric plan for that necessarily. If you're proposing so for example, a brand new site that's going to have parking lot lighting and wall packs, they actually go through and have a photometric plan prepared. And I believe that Duke Energy prepares that for their customers, and then there's private individuals that prepare it as well. And then I know a lot of the, we've worked with the light manufacturers, and we've actually sent them copies of that plans, the surveys that we have, and basically they take that information and prepare a photometric plan. So with that, I mean, we try to assist and get the information and make a determination. If it's something that doesn't trigger it, then we try not to send somebody down that path if we have good reasons to approve it without sending that, like the side distance, for example. If you're far enough away,
Right.
then we're not going to send you. And that's like with an accessory building or an add-on to a house. If your house is in the middle of a 5-acre piece of property and you're at 150 feet from all your side property boundaries, we're not going to make you go get a survey to get a permit to add an accessory building. But if you're in, on a 50-foot wide lot and your house is 42 feet wide, and you want to put it on the left side, and we have storm drainage and easements, we're probably going to say it's too close for us to call that and put it on our shoulders, so we're going to require you to get a survey. Right. If we're able to use GIS maps, we try that. First thing we do is we look in our files to see if we have a copy of an old survey that will give us the information that can be utilized. The second thing we'll do is we'll look at a GIS map and if it can be utilized. And the third case, which is not a popular decision, but if we have to, then we will require that you get a survey. We try not to do that if we can help that, because it's just additional cost.
Sure.
And we know that, we recognize that, and we don't want to create those. But at the same time, we can't find the city, at the end of the day, we can't find ourselves if all of a sudden we have a stormwater project, we got to go out there and replace that line, and there's a building that's been on a concrete slab that's been constructed there in the easement, and now we're going to basically say that the building's got to go and say, well, you permitted it.
Right.
And that's the issue, is we got to make sure from a liability standpoint that, so if we're comfortable putting on our shoulders, I mean, and that's the kind of decision that really Jeremy makes every day is, can I allow it or do I need more information? So, but that's our strategy, survey and files. Well, I'll take it back. The second one would be, I'll ask the homeowner, hey, look in your closing documents. Do you have a copy of the survey?
Right.
And then if a survey is required, a lot of times what we'll say is, and we don't recommend any surveyors, but if we look and see that the final plat, when the subdivision was recorded, was done by XYZ surveyor, we'll say, well, that was who prepared the plat. I mean, you can use anybody that's licensed in North Carolina. It doesn't matter to me who you hire, but that may be a good starting point, because me personally, I found out who recorded, my subdivision. I reached out to the service and said, hey, do you have a copy of my plot plan? Sure do. Well, can I get a copy of it? Absolutely. So, so that way we can let people know, well, you may want to check with XYZ surveyor because they may have something for you. And then that's going to show you. The other thing that we've done with the Unified Development Ordinance that since 2014 versus prior to that is we require a foundation survey on every new construction site, whether it be commercial or residential, for a new house. So if you add an accessory building, we don't require a foundation survey. But if you, so for example, Starbucks is being constructed there at Cheney. They got their footing poured, and after they poured the footings, they had to have a foundation survey done and prepared and submitted, and we compare that to what we approved to make sure it's in the right location. Provided it's in the correct location, then they're allowed to proceed moving forward. Well, we have a survey of where that foundation is. So if it's same thing with a house. So we know where the house is, we see where the property lines are. You can measure 10 feet off that back wall and build a 10-foot deep accessory building, and then you got 30 more feet, and that's where your back property line is going to be, because that foundation wall was identified in the field. So going back, you mentioned parking. We require a number of spaces. The parking space dimensions is 9 by 18 for regular spaces. Drive aisle's got to be 24 feet for two-way traffic. It's less than that for one-way and angled. We require loading and unloading spaces. Landscaping, man, you can really tell a difference over the last couple of years, pre-UDO versus post-UDO. And that's nothing against it. And we could bring back pictures and kind of show planning board if you'd like to see a little bit more of a deep dive with this. We can use some examples here in the city. It wouldn't be well, this is a bad site here. And it was pre that standard. I mean, it may be a legal non-conforming situation. It's not a negative strike against the building or the business owner. It's just, it was built when those codes weren't in play. We didn't have the street lawn requirements that we have now. The quantity, when I first started for the first, 10 or 12 years, we had an 8-foot street lawn required, and there wasn't a single shrub or tree that was required to go in it. It was just a grass strip in the front of the property. And now we have a tree shrub requirement that goes in that. And that's a huge change from what just 20 years ago.
And moving back up to parking requirements, is this where you see things like, I see where it says number, size, drive aisles, loading and unloading. This is also where your handicapped spots are in the business, where your mobile order pickups are, because that's something that's relatively new, and yet, is that covered in this now?
That is. So we didn't have before the UDO the drive-through standards that we have now. And, sometimes it's hard to kind of do a one-size-fit-all, but that's a lot of times what we have to do. So if you're a not busy drive-through, and I won't say any names, but if you're not a busy drive-through, then our 4 and 8 stacking requirement may seem excessive. But then there's others that 4 and 8 is not adequate. And you can see just with some recent modifications to sites where they're doing double drive-throughs and stacking around the building twice. And I think part of that's also since COVID.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the things that Jeremy and I have talked about is that, right now, when the UDO got adopted, we had a maximum amount of parking that you could put in there. So you had your requirement and you were limited to 125%. Well, a local surveyor requested that we bump that to 150, so 150%, which council approved. A board probably recommended approval as well. But then with a restaurant, they went to 1 space for every 100 square feet. So that's 10 per 1,000. Well, if you're a drive-through restaurant, since COVID, I think you've seen some business shifts to where they're more oriented to the drive-through piece. They're making it more about the drive-through. So one of the things that Jeremy and I have talked about is, we may want to bring back a text amendment to create almost a two-tiered restaurant parking standard. One for restaurants with drive-through, one for restaurants with dine-in. Because I don't know that the parking requirement for one without a drive-through is the same as one with a drive-through, but right now that's what it is. It's the same. So,
Well, I was also wondering, like, in retail businesses that have places for people to park while they're waiting for a mobile order to be brought to them. You know,
that's something that the UDO did
that's
not.
relatively new.
It is. And, a lot of those big box retail folks that have implemented that were probably overparked, and they were able to, they didn't do exactly a 1-for-1, but it may have been like a 1.5 to 1. So, I mean, did they lose a space or two? Yes. Technically, they should have come and seen us. And I would say for the most part, a lot of them probably did, as far as where they changed. I'm thinking like the Walmart pickup. They actually came in and said, hey, here's our parking lot plan. We're going to change these because it impacts your parking number. It could impact your ADA requirement spaces. Because one of the things that Walmart at Marine and Western talked about doing was moving the pickup over an aisle. And I'm like, you can do that, but I don't know that that's going to work well for you. The ADA standards, which is not a UDO thing, but basically, from what I understand, it says it's got to be your spaces closest to the door. So, that doesn't mean you put your pickup spaces closest to the front door. That's where your ADA spaces go. That's why you see them so close to the door. And there's a number per, one per whatever the criteria is. One for every 25 spaces and one out of every 8 has to be van accessible. And then the table, it shrinks down the more spaces you have. But yeah, if you want to make a reconfiguration of a parking lot, that requires a permit. If you're simply resealing or restriping, you could even be doing an asphalt overlay. As long as you put it back what you had, that is no permits required. We don't want to impede somebody from maintaining their site. We actually want you to maintain your site. If a pothole develops in your site, we can send you a notice of violation saying fix the pothole. So, we'd rather you fix the parking lot on your own than for us to have to tell you. And that's why we adjusted the code a few years ago to kind of clarify, as long as you're not changing the striping, then you're good.
Would that also pertain to places that allow, I guess, these donation drop-off boxes and things of that nature in their parking lot?
Well, that's two pieces. One, you'd have to have room to convert from a parking space to a donation, but it also requires other standards and permits. So, I mean, I can't say for sure that all of them have come in and obtained the necessary permits. And that's where, our Neighborhood Improvement Services Department comes into play, and they'll send notices of violations to those folks. Usually they try to start with a conversation with the landowner or property manager and say, hey, we need to get this fixed before we go through and start the official process of sending a notice of violation.
When a business reserves a parking space for, say, mobile orders or things, how does that affect their total number of parking spaces?
Electric cars.
Yeah, it's still their cars. I mean, I think the biggest thing is if you have 100 spaces and you make 10 of those pickup spaces, it's still the patrons of that business. Now, I'm speaking for Jacksonville. Other places may be more lenient and other places may be more strict. But for Jacksonville, if it's a 1-for-1, I mean, there's not a whole lot to it. I think since we've kind of talked about this already, I'll give you an example of the more trendy thing right now is the EV car charging stations. So you'll see that I'll use Smithfield's as an example. They wanted to put in some charging stations, which we allow them to do, but they don't have any extra parking spaces. So those are not designated for EV parking only. So if I get to Smithfields and all the spaces are taken up, but 5 of those charging stations, that's where I'm gonna park. It's not exclusive. However, guess what? The state legislature is working on that we have to allow EV charging stations, and it has to be exclusive for those car spaces only. So if that passes, then we won't be able to stipulate that.
So is it a rule that a new building has to have one or not yet?
Not a city's rule. I'm not aware of a rule
I
that
think it'll get to that point where that'd be a new development thing where you have to put one. It depends on how big your parking lot is and what you're doing and all that stuff.
it's possible.
Yeah, like hotels, I could see that would be a thing where.
On a lot of the hotels, they have
And
converted
restaurants,
spaces. I mean, I haven't seen many restaurants on those Smithfields, but I think the ownership of Smithfields wanted to do that. That was kind of they wanted to make that happen. I know that Jacksonville Station, the bus station, the city's transit location, Jacksonville Station, we've got to, and they are listed as EV only. But my guess is, because I don't have first-hand knowledge, but my guess is that that was extra spaces. If they're extra, then yeah, you can make them exclusive for that because they're not required spaces.
Yeah.
So if you have extra, well, you can play around with that in terms of if you want to block it off for a seasonal display, then, and the ordinance allows you to do that, well, then you can do that. If you want to have a special event, that's where you do it. If you want to convert some of them to EV only, then yeah, you can do that because they're excess parking spaces. Because a lot of folks like to provide more than what our ordinance is. Remember, our standards is the minimum number required, and then we have a maximum. But if you go in between that and you want to create some for EV only, it's just the Smithfield example that I gave you, they just didn't have any excess. If they would have had 5 extra, then they could have made it exclusive. And if the state law changes, then it could be exclusive, the way I understand it. If we change the drive-through parking requirements moving forward to a lesser number for those with a drive-through, they would be able to convert those to EV only if those other laws don't pass.
And who's gonna establish the kilowatt hour charge?
Oh, not me.
The business?
I'm not sure how that works.
Difference between a for-profit and nonprofit?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's like the solar panels. You know, the solar panels have made a comeback, and you know, people.
They say.
I don't know what it does, and then some people they're getting more, and they're sending it back through Duke's line. I mean, Mr. Dupuy may be able to speak to that a little bit. I'm not sure. You know, are you making money? Are you losing money? Are you breaking even? I'm not sure.
How would like a citizen, how would they know if they could park in a electric only spot, or how would they distinguish where they're
So the
parked?
2 examples that I just mentioned, Smithfield's, it does not say, it is not supposed to say, if it does, but we looked at the signage, it does not say EV parking only. But if you go to Jacksonville Station, it does.
And is that like a towable offense? Like if it was enforced, or if it was a EV parking only?
Who knows?
I mean, it might not be under your.
I know this, if I pull into a spot and it's required space and I get towed and I'm a patron of that business, then knowing what I know, I'm gonna have some dialogue with the
Okay.
company about why did I get towed? But that's, I mean, if that law passes, then I mean, I don't
Then
know.
at
At
that
that
point-
point, it's a different ballgame,
Right.
but.
But at the current state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, it's, at the end of the day, I mean, if every single space is taken up, because I mean, 10 per 1,000 is a lot of spaces. And you have drive-through as well. I just don't know. I mean, even on a good day, I don't know if every single space is taken up. Maybe it is, but.
So the Starbucks, they need that much parking because they're so heavy drive-through oriented? I mean, is
Well-
it because their footprint's small?
I believe we have the drive-through stacking requirement, but I believe that is considered a specialty eating establishment that has a different standard.
But then y'all change like Dunkin' Donuts, did y'all change the drive path so people won't pull in like in the 17?
Duncan has been, Duncan was, I think, pre-UDO, and they met the standards, and the owners of that Duncan have been very great to work with, very good to work with. And they have made several adjustments to eliminate the concerns that was created by the stacking offsite. So think about it. They were pre-UDO with the stacking requirements, and they have made 2 or 3 adjustments, and they have another one that they're proposing. So what they did, we actually worked with them and says, well, let's try some of these temporary solutions. Because they were a little bit undecisive, will this really work? Now, I mean, I've seen people go on the exit, well, that's a no-no. The idea behind it is that you go in and wrap around the building and then get into the queue. It works. And now that the temporary measures have worked, they actually have submitted, or at least a sketch of a submittal to permanently make those changes. And one of the difficulties on that was the inner radius when you going around is if you're in a larger vehicle, it's kind of tight. So they're gonna flatten that out a little bit. I think they have a flat face curb, which will do a number on your chrome wheels or your aluminum wheels. So I think they're gonna put in kind of a little bit more of a mountable type situation and adjust the radius. But that's pre-UDO, and think about they've made an adjustment. They've bought the land, they bought the lot behind them and then expanded into that. And now they've done the temporary measures, and then they're gonna do the permanent solution as it related to those temporary. That's what I'm saying. They have been very good to work with in terms of trying to make a bad situation better. And we have the new one that I mentioned already, Starbucks. They have to meet the stacking requirement. They actually exceed the requirements. Now, the one variable there is staffing levels and the quickness in which they prepare the orders. And the wild card is, let's see, what do I want? Do I want a cappuccino? Do I want iced coffee? How long does it take the customer, or are they ordering for everybody at the office?
Yeah.
That's a wild card there. So, the 8 and the 4, so 4 from the pickup window to the order box, and then 8 spaces behind that for a drive-through restaurant. If you're popular, if you just opened, that's another one. When a new business opens here, I never forget, he doesn't own the Krispy Kreme today, but Miles, I'm drawing a blank on his last name. His name is Miles. When he opened the Krispy Kreme, they broke every record except one. Sales, numbers, volume, all of it. The one thing they didn't make was the week. They didn't break the record for the week. You know why? Because nobody was there on Sunday. You know what happened the week they opened on Sunday that year? Super Bowl Sunday happened that day. I was the only one in the drive-thru. We went by there.
It's not Super Bowl approved food.
We left the restaurant where we were watching the game, and there was nobody. We stopped and got some donuts the very first week. So had the Super Bowl not been that week, they probably would have broke the record for their week sales as well. That's one of those things where you've seen it all over. When you open, everybody goes there, right? Everybody wants to go to the new restaurant or new business, and parking may not be enough. The drive-through stacking may not be enough, but eventually we hope that it kind of tapers down to the point to where
Like that's a tight drive-through right there in the back. Trying to get through that thing.
So some of that is, it meets our minimum widths for one way. Think about the, state employees that bank drive-throughs. I kind of like my wheels and tires, and yeah, it's a little too close for me, but I think most of them are 11 or 12 feet, and I think our minimum's 10. So most of them exceed it, but it can get a little tight. And that's I think with the Dunkin', that first radius is tight right now, or it was even worse before. But making all that work, and then also allow the people that park and go inside to then be able to get out and leave the site. Because we had people going in the exits, we had people going in the exit, down, turning around, and temporary measures, you can run over a bollard and things like that. When they put the permanent solutions in, it's a concrete, median, a little different ballgame.
Yeah.
So, if you look at Chick-fil-A on Western, where they just revamped to create the double drive-through, well, if you look at it, they set it up for a double. Well, sometimes in front of the building it serves as a double, and sometimes they've narrowed it down to a single, and then it flares back to a double. And, you know, they far exceed the 8 and 4 standard that the UDO has. I mean, they've got about, I think, 30, 35 stacking spaces with, when you have it as a double all the way around. So it does stay full. So, but some restaurants, they don't. And it's kind of one of those things to where, but how do I say, well, hey, Chick-fil-A and Starbucks, you have to do a 20 space stacking. But hey, restaurant that's not quite as good with the drive-through, you don't have to do 20. It's a restaurant's a restaurant. The standard is the standard. Right. And that's what makes our job difficult sometimes, because we know that happens, but how do I say, Nick, you don't have to do this, but Chase, you got to. Sorry, bud. I mean, we try to be fair and equitable with it, and when we develop a standard, I mean, it makes it really hard where, and one of the things, I'll jump ahead, you know, we talk about signage. Well, you know, one of the things that we can do certain things, and, you know, it will make things look a little better. The problem is, it's gonna get more expensive, and it's going to negatively impact, you know, small startup businesses. And the example that I'll give is, you know, you have some landowners, business owners, that they require all the signage to be channel letters. We don't do that. The landlord does. We could, but the difference between having channel letters, that means every time a new business goes in there, they have to have those signs manufactured from scratch. If it's a 4x8 rectangle up on that wall, they pop the face out, reface it, pop it back in there. It doesn't even require a permit. It's like changing a light bulb. You just reface it. So if you say that they all have to be channel letters, from a city standpoint, well, you've just made that box sign non-conforming, and whenever it comes off, it can't be put back up, and now you have channel letters. Well, that's stuff that staff, we think about. I mean, if we propose that to the planning board and city council, I mean, we're gonna need to tell you, but you know, it's like we did with the landscaping. We're gonna double the cost of landscaping. We told the mayor and council that. We told the planning board that. And council adopted those standards, and that's what we have now compared to what we used to have. So yeah, it's a more expensive landscaping standard that we have. But we told council that this is what you're doing, but you're also beautifying the city. So if we brought a channel letter situation, we would have to say, look, the problem is this is gonna look nice, but the flip side to that, and that's where I think that what we try to do here in Jacksonville is sensible regulations. You can go to some municipalities where they make the developer choose 2 colors.
Like Cary.
Cary, Raleigh, there's all kinds of places. I mean, it's odd, you know, when I think about Subway, what colors are you thinking about?
Green and yellow.
Green and yellow. Well, you go up in Raleigh, guess what colors you're gonna see?
Whatever that is.
Red and white.
Yeah.
I don't know if it has anything to do with NC State, but there's one shopping center that I know that all the signs are red and white. Every sign in the shopping center is red and white. I mean, could we? Yes. Should you? I mean, that's up to the elected bodies and staff to, you know, I wouldn't suggest it, because I think that you take some of the individualism, you know, out of it. And likewise with the box signs versus the
Cause you have a small business trying to go to a strip center with, say, box stores, you know, they can afford, you know, an expensive sign where, you know, startup possibly couldn't.
right, and a face replacement, and while they're probably not cheap, better than having a channel letter sign installed, from what I would imagine. I'm not asked the sign company to give me a price of X versus Y, but I'm pretty sure that
They're a lot more.
they are.
Yeah.
And then the other component is, you know, technically, you know, as long as you get a sign permit for it, you can opt to, versus a cabinet, you could have just the face and somehow mount it to the wall with, you know, fasteners somehow. And that wouldn't be backlit though. So most of the ones that you see that project off the wall a little bit, the box signs, they have lights behind it. But we don't require the sign to be illuminated. I mean, I think that's more of a business. You want to have it illuminated. You don't have to. And if you're a startup, I mean, the easiest way would be the window signage. The problem is window, from our definition, is a wall sign, and it requires a permit, and it's part of your maximum number. And I'm past the 5.6 is, let's see, landscaping's 5 point, that's 5 2, so I'm jumping to 512. So let's move on. So exterior line transportation impact analysis. So TI, that's our transportation department handles that. They work with DOT. That's where, if you trigger a TI because you have so many trips a day, you have to do a parking study, and or there may be a waiver with improvement. So there's different things, and even though it's on our UDO, our transportation department handles that. It's part of the TRC process, but we don't directly handle that. The transportation office does. Community forms, that deals more with your subdivisions. Small non-residential design standards. So this is where, if you look at a lot of the buildings that's been built since 2014, under 40,000, building rotation, facade, rooftop screening, we have a glass percentage requirement. That's why you see glass on the new buildings. We require so much glazing to it, 12 or 15%, depending on if you're small versus large building. Facade lighting, which we don't require, that's just mainly comes back to, you're allowed to illuminate the facade, it's just the dark sky standard. It can't be flashing, it can't be revolving, those kind of things. The large standards over 40,000, same standards, it's just a little bit different percentages wise. Multifamily design standards, so townhouses, apartments, we have certain design criteria that you have to have. Single family design standards, this is where we make recommendations only because a few years ago, the legislature said you can no longer regulate design standards for houses. Once again, that's one where the legislature has taken away from our ability to regulate. Even though I've had in the past realtors and residents that are adjacent to a piece of property that they were concerned that the way that they knew development was going to be able to happen next door to them was going to impact negatively their tax value, because they are not being required to build it per the standards that we used to be able to require. So unfortunately, I think what happened was probably a little bit too much government overreach, where they were getting down to what color can you paint your houses and things like that. And what happened was, I believe, well, the General Assembly, heard from their constituents and said, well, we're going to squash that. And that's one of those situations where it's unfortunate, but at the same time, it's because we kind of did it to ourselves probably. And I won't say the city of Jacksonville, but I mean, cities, towns, planning staff, et cetera, got a little maybe overzealous with some of the standards and caused that to kind of be removed from our ability to regulate. I mean, before, if you think about all the changes in the downtown area, that's kind of was our design standards, where we wanted to kind of look like an old downtown and historic kind of situation. Now they're in the ordinance's recommendations, only we can't require it. Signage, so that's where we get into 512. So you can see I put a lot of text on this one. I figured that, parking, landscaping, maybe building design, but signage would be one that we may dive into a little bit, just because of, it's just so visible, and it's probably one that you kind of realize and recognize more so than a lot of the others. But, we have all sorts of stipulations in terms of, maximum height 35 feet. In some cases it's 15, 10, depending on the zoning district. The number of freestanding signs, the message center signs that, you can have the changeable message every 8 seconds, not illuminated, not animated, not flashing. The building facade, the temporary signage. I know a few years back, the planning board, I think, raised the issue with feather flags, and we created standards for feather flags, and that, each business gets one for every 50 feet of frontage, and then you have a multi-tenant, they get at least one per tenant space, even if they're not 50 feet wide. And we also have some verbiage in there about, you cannot cut trees and shrubs for signage purposes. We have specific sign limitations for adult business. Billboards is within this section. and all sorts of, I mean, there's exemptions, there's permit exclusions, there's all kinds of things. And then you had a few years ago, the Gilbert, Arizona case that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court case. So it further makes it difficult for us to, give an example. You can have a temporary real estate sign, a for sale sign that's no bigger than, 4 square feet, temporarily. Oh, can't do that, because we basically were regulating the content. So with that Gilbert, Arizona case, we can't look at it and say, well, that's a real estate sign, you can have X square feet, but hey, it was a church. It was a church in Arizona they felt they were being treated unfairly, and they were sent a notice of violation, and then it went all the way through the process, all the way to the largest court of the land. And so like directional signs, like where a lot of these corporate America, they want to have a directional sign, enter here, drive through, thanks for coming, XYZ company name on it. Well, you can have one on the east side of the driveway, pretty much that's all we say. So if there's 4 businesses that share that driveway, you can have one on each side, and it's no bigger than 4 square feet. Because I can't get into, well, you can have one and we can't regulate content. So we don't get into whether it says enter here, exit here. If it's a governmental type sign, like a one-way do not enter, that's different. That's a directional governmental type sign. But if it's these little decorative, that Gilbert, Arizona case has really made it difficult for, things that we're able to do and not able to do. And we've made some adjustments. There may be some others that we haven't adjusted that technically we should. And we see a lot of churches where they want to set out a sign out here directing to go down this road. Well, nobody else can do that. The church doesn't get to do that. Interestingly enough, in the Gilbert case, you had a church that was being treated differently on the flip side, went all the way to the Supreme Court case. So, and that's the thing is that, sometimes when that happens, I mean, it also limits our ability. It's not just the state legislature, it's also Supreme Court cases like this. So, so that may be something that we're, whether tonight or at another meeting that, you guys, the planning board wants to take a deeper dive into the signage component. And then a little bit less glamorous, but street naming and addressing and performance guarantees. So street naming, addressing, although we work closely with our GIS staff, if we have to change your address, assign new addresses, and then performance guarantees, that's where either a subdivision or a site plan, let's say that you've not been able to, there's a drought, and right now would not be the good time to plant your landscaping. You can post a performance guarantee and open on a temporary CO until you can get the landscaping installed. But the more prominent place for performance guarantees would be subdivisions, where you haven't installed all your infrastructure. So Article 4 and 5, that's where a lot of our daily stuff, that's where the meat and potatoes are, reside in the UDO. Article 6, if you want to subdivide, split up your piece of property, there's an exempt subdivision that's found in Article 2 per the statutes, but then if you're wanting to build a residential or commercial subdivision, Article 6 is where the standards would be, tied in with Article 3. One thing the UDO added was a cluster subdivision. We've never used that, but really we haven't had a lot of subdivision in recent years. We had so much with the growth of force back in the 07, 08 timeframe. And then since about 2010, we really didn't have any new subdivisions until recently with Harvest Meadows and the vineyards, still doing infrastructure installation. And there's 3 or 4 others that, are either waiting in the wings or have started some of the processes. But in our commercial subdivisions, we still have some out there. The Gateway Marketplace was the newest one, and before that was probably Western Forum. And there's still lots available really for both of those, although we've seen quite a few proposals that, will fill some of those, if not all of them up. So we may see some sort of a commercial subdivision here coming up in short order once those get completely filled up or somebody's ready to start a new one. One of the things that the subdivision standards has is the recreation requirements. That's where there's a land dedication or money in lieu of provided to the city based on a formula. Article 7 is another one that we didn't have really as specific as we do now with the UDO as it deals with grandfather clauses, technical terms, nonconformities, general terms, people, the grandfather clause. The idea behind a grandfather clause is it's not, indefinite forever and ever. It has a end date, and the end date is if you close or shut down longer than 180 days, then it's done. Another would be if it gets damaged or destroyed more than 50%, then there's things that come into play. You have non-conforming uses. You have mobile homes, 1-for-1 swap we do not allow. So if a mobile home is there and it's no longer allowed in that district, it can stay until it is no longer fixable and or it is removed from the property. It cannot go back unless the zoning district allows it. So this is only dealing with if it's a non-conforming situation. Non-conforming structures, that's where, just the house may encroach into setbacks a little bit. There's a single family exemption that was put in place after the UDO was adopted. So think about, a catastrophic event, fire, tornado, hurricane, tree falls through the house, completely destroys it. If it doesn't meet setbacks, then it goes bye-bye. Or it can only be put back in accordance with whatever the code states. And in some cases, it can't go back there. It would have to shift, whatever it may be. But, this is one where, with those type of situations, not very comfortable to kind of deal with, but if it's non-conforming, the idea behind it is that it's not lawful for a reason and then eventually it'll go away. If it was okay to be lawful, then it doesn't need to be non-conforming. That's how I look at it. So if, for example, if a mobile home belongs in that district, well then we need to do a text amendment. We need to prepare a text amendment to allow it in that district. But that's also why we created the mobile home district a year or so ago. Even though nobody's come in for a rezoning, we know that there are some mobile home subdivisions that exist in our jurisdiction. And, we created it as an opportunity, versus not having that tool in our toolbox is what I mentioned. So at least we have that tool now, even though nobody's utilized it, at least it's there versus it not being there. The other one, dealing with non-conforming structures, if you've heard anything about the town center situation, those structures, they were, deemed unsafe. They were in really bad shape. You had some that were within the setback and therefore it could not be rebuilt. Now, since that time, they requested a text amendment to reduce the setback, which has allowed, I think there's about 112 that were non-conforming. Now with that text amendment, there's only about 10 or 12 from what I understand that are non-conforming, but that's still an issue. Now, we've talked to them about strategies on possibilities of what they could do moving forward. And one of the things that you may see in sometime in the near future would be a request to go to a planned unit development where they can kind of specify their standards. And if adopted, that may provide the relief for those other 12 units. May also provide some relief to the parking and the landscaping standard. Until it's submitted, we don't know what they're going to be requesting. And then what's the board going to recommend and what's city council going to do with it. So the other part this deals with non-conforming lots and, back up. The last two, the correction non-conforming site features. That's where your parking, signage, lighting, landscaping, buffering. Are you expanding or are you renovating? Or are you doing both? And then that's where the percentages of the structure value comes into play. Or the expansion percentage. So if you have a 5,000 square foot building and you're doubling the size, well, then you're gonna be 100% compliance with the current codes. Prior to 2014, we didn't have that. So we've applied this. I'll give you the best example, well, a good example, when you had the Lowe's and you had the Best Buys and the Dick's Sporting Goods moved in there, and then Big Lots. Then Big Lots wanted to do an expansion. When they did that expansion, they triggered some of they met the parking criteria. They didn't meet all of the landscaping requirements. That's why if you go there and look, they added landscape islands out in the parking lot for the right side, the Big Lot side of that development. And then if you look at the street, there's a heavier presence of landscaping on the right-hand side because they only had to do 50% of the installation. Now, they could have done 50% across the board, or they could have done 50% of the width. They chose to do 50% of the width, and they focused it all in that one area. And we kind of give people the option. Do you do 4 feet across the whole front, or do you go ahead and do 8 for 50% of the front? And if you're having to remove asphalt and things like that, you got to decide, do you want to do 4 foot now all the way across and then another 4 later, and that's a 250 feet of frontage you have to do, or do you do 125 feet of 8 feet and then leave the rest? And we give people the option to where, you know, depending on what they're doing, it may behoove them to do all across the board versus only on one side, but we're flexible when it comes to that. So that's another one where we have applied that. It's sometimes not popular, but you know, once again, you know, the idea behind it is you're going to gain compliance at some point in time. So if you're going to expand your building, if you're going to do a major renovation to have this building stick around another 25, 30 years, and you're going to spend $1 million inside the building, well, now we say, well, now you're going to spend some money outside the building to bring it up to speed with the codes. And it's an equal proportion. Article 8, this is where you will find the neighborhood improvement services and staff when we, on our side, where we enforce the code, whether it be through permit review or if there's a violation that occurs in the field, what happens? You know, what are the processes and protocols and remedies? So Article 8, that's usually specific to an enforcement case, but it resides within the UDO. And then Article 9, this is where you will find rules for interpretations, rules of measurements, and the use classifications, categories, and use types. And primarily you'll find here that we use probably daily would be the definition part. So that being said, be happy to answer any questions that the board may have as it relates to the UDO. You can tell me now, you can think about it and tell us later. And if the board would like to go into kind of a deeper dive into, you know, one section of the code or 5 sections of the code, we'll be happy to do that. You know, and if not, I appreciate the time and going over this with you and the folks that may, you know, watch it on G10 or YouTube or Granicus or wherever they may find it. And I hope this kind of, you know, gives the board a little bit of an overview and kind of what kind of goes into, you know, applying, you know, our codes and by the time it comes here for city council consideration, you know, this is kind of the back, you know, the staff side of things that we deal with when we bring text amendments or development proposals or whatever it may be for consideration.
I'm glad you know what you know, and I don't want to know everything you know.
Logan
does.
You know what? I feel like it. I mean, I think it is very educational to me. It does inform me a lot of what you can and can't do. And because before I got into this, I mean, I didn't know half of them, so still don't know a ton. But it is very good. I do enjoy it.
And it may not be like it needs to be. It may need to be better in some regards and worse in others. It depends on, like I said, what's out of the fence on whether it's better or worse. I mean,
And sometimes it has to change based on legislation,
absolutely.
or it has to change on how society's changed.
It was like the whole EV thing. I mean, 10 years ago, that wasn't even a thing. And then
That's
now
right.
as we,
And the
you know,
mobile
throw
pickups.
on, and 10 years from now,
And
they might
drive
all, you know, you never know, so.
And, you know, cases and legislation and The other thing is, I think that, we talked a lot tonight about the drive-through. I think the standards were needed because now, that standard is there for anybody that wants to have a drive-through facility. And there's other standards as well. It's not just for restaurants. There's some other drive-through facilities like pharmacies have a different standard. But the idea behind it is we want to make sure that you're stacking on your property and that people are still able to get around your site and that you're not backed onto the street, which is a traffic safety concern. That's a public safety concern.
Mhm.
And that's always paramount for us is that, when the cars were stacked onto the highway, we didn't really have a choice. We had to, we could have done one of two things. We could have basically wrote tickets. Police department could have wrote tickets to the people that were blocking the roads, or we could have said, hey, owners, we have a problem. We need to try to see if we can come up with a solution. And that's kind of what they've been doing in that Duncan example, for one. And now we haven't had the stacking. I don't know if we ever had a rear end, but if we didn't, there was enough close calls that something had to be done. Sure. And that being said, one of the other things to think about is, if you've got a really, really big piece of property and, you can cut it up, subdivide it there along Western Boulevard or Henderson Drive or wherever, and you have plenty of depth to make it work. But if you've got a smaller lot and you still can meet the dimensional requirements, we cannot plan for everybody. And I never will forget that, we had, I won't divulge too much, but I was sitting in the Walmart parking lot with Mr. John Parker, who's retired surveyor and land planner here in town before he retired and sold the business. And we were sitting there talking, and I kid you not, a truck drove up over the curb, through the landscape and down the other side. And I looked at Mr. Parker and I said, we can't plan for everybody. We can try, but if somebody's gonna drive over the curb, I guess if we put up a 5-foot tall bollard, maybe that would solve
Slow
the
them
problem.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it may not. So
That's also vandalism. That's against the law on a lot of different levels, but.
So, if there's no questions, then, and if the board, if anybody were to think of something, feel free to email me or jot it down and bring it up next month. The sooner the better, because that way we can go ahead and start preparing if the board does have questions, so that we can kind of prepare, a deeper dive into that section. And it may be, it's one of those things where let's have a section, every planning board meeting, let's have one segment of, for Article 5, let's talk about parking one night, let's talk about landscaping the next, and let's talk about lighting, and we'll go through that, and we'll be happy to do that, because, I think it helps the board, but I also think that this may help city council. Council can decide to watch this. The citizens can, and if somebody's watching this and they have questions, that's what we're here for. Come by and see us, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, our door's open. Usually somebody's here that can answer the question. There is an occasional time where we're not, so appointments are better, but usually we're here. And, we'll be happy to try to answer any of those questions that may exist and try to explain it and assist, our citizens going through with whatever it is they're trying to do.
Is there any numbers showing what kind of impact the UDO has had on the development process, how long it's taken? Has it shortened it? Has it made it longer? Or cost increases or decreases? And
the timing piece, we don't have, and that's one of the things that we're working on right now with the ERP is we're looking at a new software package, and our portion hasn't been bid yet. That'll be in the next month or two. And we would hope that with the dashboard situation, that a lot of these newer programs, because our program we've had since the mid-90s, so it's an older program. So reporting the number of days, like I would like to be able to do and show, we really don't have anything. So I don't know that I would be able to say pre versus post UDO. the one thing that I can say about development review as it relates to building plan review and site plan review in the E-plan system, you can look into, there's some on-demand type reports that, let's say you said, well, I want to see how long it took us from start to finish on the, what's a new,
Like the bus station.
that's a city project.
Okay.
We could look at that. So how long did it take from when the application was submitted to when the actual approval happened? We could show that for both a site plan for the Jacksonville station and then also from the building review standpoint. And it actually shows us when the applicant submitted their application and it was keyed, when they actually uploaded it, when it started its review after it cleared the completeness, how many review cycles we had, how long did staff have it, how long did the applicant have it. So, I mean, you could look at it from start to finish and see, review cycle 1, it shows how many days staff had it, how many days did the designer have it, and you can do that for every review cycle. And at the bottom, I believe it gives you a cumulative total number. So it would show whether that review happened very quickly, whether it was long. If it was long, was it because of staff, because of the applicant's agent, a little bit of both?
Right.
But yeah, what you specifically asked for, no, that would be, we don't, to my knowledge, we don't have that ability. Now, I would love to have that with the new system
Right.
to where, we could show you how quickly something is done, approved.
Right.
But no,
Not
but I can.
before, yeah, because it was sort of all manual at that point.
Landscaping, it was probably, you wouldn't be able to tie it to the UDO because it was really pre-UDO and we just moved it forward with the UDO. But like I mentioned earlier, the landscaping component, dollars back then, we told council that it was going to be about 50% increase in cost or double. I can't remember. I think it was 50%. We actually reached out to 1 or 2 local landscapers and said, hey, this versus this, what are the costs going to be?
Right.
Parking, I don't know that our standards really changed a whole lot. Usually on the parking piece, a lot of times the developers, it doesn't seem like we've had an issue where we require too much parking. I would argue that they probably want to provide more parking than what we'll allow though.
Okay.
And that's why we bumped that 125 to 150%. And the idea behind it is, I won't mention the business, but we had a situation one time where the business was like, wow, we need more parking. We don't want to seem busy. You have enough parking, you just don't want to seem busy.
Right.
Do you need to have parking for the one time of the year? Remember with asphalt, think about what that does. Number one, it drives up cost, but of course, if the developer wants to do it, then,
Right.
But the other thing that it does is it drives up their reoccurring cost for stormwater, for their ERU stormwater fee. It increases stormwater runoff. And, there's also some environmental pollution that goes along with that in terms of, I think the most evident, and it's really, really cool in a way, another way it's not, the few times we get snow around here, it's amazing. You can literally be driving down Western Boulevard or Gum Branch Road, and when you're in the center part of the city, it's rain, it's not snowing, and you get to the edge, and it's like a switch has been turned on. And the temperature difference between where all the asphalt is versus where the asphalt's not. So, that's something to think about as well, because we got stormwater runoff, and that's something to where it's kind of that balance. And that's why, the consultant came up with the cap. And, after 7 years of vetting it, it made its way into the UDO and it stayed there for adoption. But then, after we applied it, it got bumped up to 150%. So the moral of the story is, if something's too strict or not strict enough, we certainly can, sometimes there's flexibility.
Right.
In other cases, we need to revise the UDO to adjust it like we did with, the restaurant standard. And now because of the COVID and the drive-through situation, I think that you'll see us bring a proposal at some point to say we need to split drive-through restaurants versus just sit down, because I think the ratio, it probably needs to be different. Now, we haven't had anybody come in and say that that's a problem yet, but I don't know that we've had any new recent, well, some chickens came in, but they didn't have an issue with the number. But
What about that? Is it Jaggers that's being built right now?
and Jaggers, that's right. So, I mean, now sometimes people would say, you know, will tell us, they'll be brutally honest and say, man, this parking is a little crazy, it's too much. And sometimes you have people where they won't ever say anything, they just do per the code.
Mm.
And, you know, so it's kind of one of those things to where if they felt like it was a little bit too much, you know, it would have been nice for them to have said, hey, look, you know, this is kind of more than what we were kind of seeing now. Would there be any way for a reduction? Speaking of that, there is a parking demand study that could be done. If you want to go above or below, there is a parking demand study. Now, you know, I tell people don't go out and have a parking demand study done. If we have an example here in town that we can utilize, there's no better parking demand study than what we already have. So if, I hate using, I've used all kinds of business names, I hate using them, so I'm gonna use it. So Buffalo Wild Wings, when they were built in Old Chicago next door, you know, they started having, you know, very popular places at certain times of the day, evening, and they were parking on the streets, and then traffic and safety made the streets no parking. So basically that caused the back of the Buffalo, they basically expanded the parking lot. Now, it's intended to be for a future building pad, but we didn't make them perform a parking demand study because there was clearly a need. We didn't make them go out and have a study performed by a traffic engineer to say they needed more parking.
They knew they had a problem.
Well, you could see it.
Yeah.
I mean, if I can see it with my own two eyes, I mean, I think that's, I mean, we can document it that you don't have enough. And I mean, I think the same thing with, you know, drive-throughs. The problem is you may have one or two that don't have enough during certain times of the day, but every other drive-through facility is fine. You don't need to tweak the number. So, I mean, do you go with the worst case scenario? I mean, you could, but I mean, you start applying you know, right now we have 4 and 8 that we apply to all restaurants. If we took that to a 6 and a 12, not all restaurants may need that 6 and 12, but if we adopt that as the standard, so then how do you differentiate between who needs the 6 and the 12 and who doesn't? That's what I said earlier, is that's difficult for us to kind of do.
Mm.
I'm not saying that there's not a way, we just haven't thought about what is the way to kind of deal with that now. So. And I mean, a lot of things that you'll see is, you know, there's a lot of companies, I mean, they pride themselves on being 100% code compliant. So if your code says that you gotta have 100 spaces, then they're gonna put 100 spaces in. And then somebody else may come along and say, well, I think that's crazy, that's too much, or that's not enough.
Mm.
But we haven't gotten that a lot of times. I mean, the amendment to the restaurants came from a local surveyor. So I assume that surveyor had a conversation with one of his clients, with one of his customers, and they said, well, that's not enough parking. And as a result, he then adjusted the code. He petitioned to have the code amended. And that's the things, after we adopted the code, I mean, we've done 47 amendments in 9 years. I mean, when we've seen that there's things that aren't quite working, we've adjusted the code. I mean, we averaged over 5 a year. So, I mean, if we see something at a staff level that needs to be tweaked. So, it's a living, breathing document.
Mm.
I think you got it covered. Thanks a lot. Yeah, Ryan, you've done a fantastic job.
Yep.
Thank you, Ryan.
I would urge you to take a look at what we did, and be prepared either by email or by some way conveying to Ryan something you want to look at further. And I do like your idea of maybe the next couple of times, 2 or 3 times, that we might break this up and do, you know, like just one topic, and then, because, you know, when we do them all, it's kind of
Mind numbing.
it can be a long night.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why I knew, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't even know what time it is, but we may have went a little long for the overview, but I knew that we couldn't get into, dive into really the specifics on a lot of these sections. I mean, so, I mean, if there's like, well, we want to start with Article 5 and and only 3 or 4 of those sections, I mean, we can certainly do that, go ahead and start preparing those and have a dialogue, when the agenda allows it. I mean, there's been some meetings where we haven't had any meetings, and then there's been other meetings where, we had 3 or 4 items, and adding that may or may not be the desire of the board. So we certainly can put it on there, and then if it's,
But I think if we plan it right, we can take the items that take the most time and put them on the nights we have only one thing. And then the items that maybe take, clustered very little, put them on the night, or maybe not have one on the night we have 3 items.
Right.
Is this
but
also?
if there's something that interests the board more so than the other, I mean, I'd say let's start there, because I think that.
Strike while the iron is hot. Is this your report also, or do you also have a report?
No, I have no report tonight.
Move to adjourn, sir.
We have a motion to adjourn.
Second.
And a second. All those in favor?
Stand up.
Okay.